Welcome, my students and listeners. Today, in this video, we will discuss the 18th century literatures. The 18th century literature are the 18th century in England, as you can see on the screen. The 18th century in England is called the Classical Age or the Augustan Age in literature. And it is also called the age of good sense or the age of reason. So, the 18th century is called the classical age in English literature on account of three reasons. Number one, generally the term classic refers to the writers of the highest rank in any nation. Number two, in every national literature, there is a period when a large number of writers produce work of great merit. For example, the reign of Augustus is called the classical age of Rome, and the age of Dante is called the classical age of Italian literature. And number three, during this period, the English writers rebelled against the exaggerated style of writings and they demanded some specific rules to write poetry, drama, and prose. So the 18th century is called the classical age because the writers followed the classicism of the ancient writers, but somewhat in a narrow sense. And 18th century is also called Augustan age. This term was chosen by the writers of the 18th century themselves, who saw in Pope, Edison, Swift, and Johnson the modern parallels to Horace, Virgil, and other brilliant writers who made Roman literature famous during the reign of Emperor Augustus. So, the 18th century is also called the age of reason or the age of good sense because the people thought that they could stand on their own legs and they can conduct their affairs in the light of their own reason. It was widely assumed during the 18th century that every man was competent to decide through his own reason and wisdom. So now we come to the overview of the 18th century literature. As in the previous ages, we learned before in previous videos, the poetical works were given prominence. Now in 18th century, for the first time, the prose occupies the front position. As it was the age of social, political, religious, and literary controversies, so in such circumstances, the poetry was considered as inadequate. Therefore, there was a rapid development in prose. The two main features of the Restoration period, realism and precision, were carried to further perfection in the 18th century literature. The 18th century was depiction and drama, as the old Puritanic prejudice against the theatres continued, and the court also withdrew its parentage. Goldsmith and Sheridan were the only writers who produced plays having literary merit. The main feature of this age was the origin and development of the novel, which was fed and nourished by the great masters like Daniel Defoe, Richardson, Fielding, and Smollett. And another important thing which is to be considered is the early part of the 18th century is that the classic uh, the classical rules and ideals reigned supreme. As the 18th century is a long period, therefore it can be divided into four topics. One, the age of Pope. Number two, the age of Johnson. Number three, 18th century novel. Four, 18th century drama. In the age of Pope, the poets were more interested in town and cultural society. Pope is considered as the greatest poet of the early part of the 18th century. As Professor Eaton calls that he was the prince of classicism. Pope was very short in height and I think not tall than poor Pete, often suffering from diseases. And apart from this, he was a Catholic and therefore he had to work under various restrictions. But in spite of all these hurdles and restrictions, this small and ugly man left a permanent mark on the literature of his age. He was highly intellectual and ambitious. The main quality of his poetry is its correctness. When he was only at the age of 23, that he published his essay on criticism and got reputation from that. During his lifetime, he was considered a model poet. The later part of 18th century is known as the age of Johnson because Johnson is considered the greatest poet of the later part of the 18th century. But in the age of Johnson, some cracks appeared in the edifice of the classicism in the form of revolts against uh, the ideals of classicism, and there was a revival of romantic tendency, which was the feature of Elizabethan period. So the main genre during 18th century is novel, as we mentioned before, and the four pillars who supported the building of novel in 18th century were Daniel Defoe, Richardson, Fielding, and Smollett. And the drama of 18th century, as we mentioned before, that the Restoration period or the 18th century period, mainly the 18th century literature was deficient in drama because um, mm, the old puritanic prejudice against the theater continued, and the court also withdrew its patronage, and there was no assistance from the government. So the decline in 18th century literature of drama was on its top, and the main genre in 18th century was novel.